I'm Deborah Lupton. I'm chairing this panel on care and automation, experiences, tensions and possibilities. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and owners of the land from which I'm speaking, which is Canberra today, the Ngunnawal people, whose lands were never ceded. Now I've put up on this slide who's going to be speaking, what we're going to be talking about. It's a fairly traditional sort of presentation format. I've asked everyone to keep their talks to between 10 and 12 minutes, 12 at the most, so that we'll have a good amount of time at the end for shared Q&A. So if you have any questions, please jot them down or put them in the chat for those who are online as you think of them. And then we'll save them all up for the very end. We should hopefully have about 15 minutes, although we've now lost a few minutes just getting going, but maybe at least 10 minutes where we can have a shared Q&A at the very end. So I'm going to kick things off, and then we'll have a combination of talks from people who are associated with the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making in Society, and also people who aren't but have some really interesting research to talk about today that speaks to our theme on care and automation. And they're from RMIT, and we have basically a combination of interesting people from both University of New South Wales and Sydney and people from RMIT there in Melbourne. So I'm really interested to hear what everyone else has to say. And just to bear in mind that when we're talking about care, one thing that I really wanted to emphasise with this panel was the notion of care, not just in relation to human care, but in relation to how we think about the environment, other living things, and natural parts of our world. So we're really sort of taking a very expansive view on care and how automation may or may not contribute to the care of our world. So having said that, I will go on and start my presentation, which is very much about those dimensions. So this is a presentation about a project that I'm working on with Ash Watson and Vaughan Wozniak O'Connor, who work with me at UNSW Sydney in our little Centre of Excellence team there. And I'm given the title here, Sensory Engagements with Lively Data, Understanding the More Than Human World with and Through Nature and Art. And I'm going to be talking about a specific project that we're actually right in the middle of. We're in the early stages of doing our empirical research for it. So I'm basically going to talk about this work in progress and some of the things we've been, some of the approaches that we've been taking. So it's really timely actually to be talking about how humans interact with more than human worlds, particularly given the terrible revelations from yesterday's report that was released by our Minister for the Environment, Tanya Plibersek, called Australia's State of the Environment 2021, which the former government sat on and wouldn't release. Basically, we all suspect because of the awful things it had to say about just what is happening with our environment here in Australia and in terms of species being lost and all the other really detrimental effects that humans have had on our environment here in Australia. But what I was pleased to see when I was reading through the report, I haven't managed to read through every single part of it, but particularly in the opening sections, the scientists who wrote the report, who were commissioned to write the report, at all steps along the way are really emphasising Indigenous perspectives on understanding the importance of country and the relationships that we as humans have with the natural environment, with other living things. So this is actually from the Ngunnawal Nation, this quote here, and as I mentioned, I'm in Ngunnawal country right now, so it really speaks a lot to me. I've got an image there that I took of a fabulous exhibition, again here in Canberra at the National Museum, called Connection, where you basically walk into a room with huge screens with digitised representations of Indigenous artwork from all around the country, videos showing Indigenous people engaging in their art making practices and their country related practices, talking about their relationship to country. So I really recommend it if you do visit Canberra to go and have a look at this, but it's also really relevant to what I'm talking about today, because we are talking about making art that will help us as humans connect more closely to planetary health. And this is another section from this report on the Australia and the environment and where we are now. And I noted this as well, that there's strong emphasis that we are all stewards of our environment. We all play an important role in protecting and restoring our environment. So this is all about care. It's all about care for country, for the landscape, for living creatures and non-living things in our worlds. And again, I like to see the privileging of the knowledges that Indigenous people can share with us and make us more wise about these practices, but also the role of community groups, individuals, as well as, you know, experts like scientists and investors, industries and businesses. Wouldn't it be great if industries and businesses were a bit more careful about our environment, and governments for that matter. So our project is called Creative Approaches to Health Information Ecologies, and the objectives are, two main objectives: to expand the notion of health information beyond that of digital data, and to sensitise people to their inter-embodied relationships and roles within planetary health ecologies. And one way you can do that sensitisation or attunement, is through art. And here's another image I took when I was visiting that exhibition I was just talking about, Connection, which is very much art-led in terms of making those connections between people and country. When you go into this huge room that has all these screens with the artworks and videos of country, it's a really immersive experience. There's lots of sound, there's images on the floor that children love to run around and play on. So it's all very interactive. There's smells that are conveyed, but I had my mask on, so that blocked out that part of it, but it's a very multi-sensory experience. And our conceptual approach is very similar. It's more than human, and it's also more than digital. Even though we're working within a centre that's very much about automated decision-making and other emerging digital technologies, we want to really show not only how we can go beyond just focusing on those technologies, but also showing how those technologies can help us become more attuned to the environment. So it's a sort of a two-way engagement that we're looking for in our approach in this project. Now, I won't go through every single one of these questions because there are quite a few of them, but these are the research questions that seek to achieve our aims. So we're very much interested in this notion of health information / health data, but really expanding that out from digital data, which there's been a lot of emphasis on recently in medicine and healthcare, the idea, even sort of applied sort of person-led self-tracking initiatives, which have been emphasised as a way of people learning more about themselves, about their health, about their fitness and illness states. But we want to sort of go beyond that. We want to acknowledge that, yes, those practices are and those devices are really important ways of people learning about their bodies and their states of health and illness and well-being. But we want to look at the connections between the natural world and the digital world, and sort of go in our sort of emphasis on more than digital, more than human. So we're interested about marks left on people's bodies, marks left on the environment that people may leave on other living things or on non-living things. We see those marks as a form of health data. What do people observe from walking through place and space, through time, that can help them learn more about themselves, but also about the health of the planet? How can we as researchers help to attune people to these connections? And this gets us to the idea of art making, which is something that's a really crucial part of this project. So there's various stages of this project, Creative Approaches to Health Information Ecologies. And we're working with a fabulous community partner called Health Consumers New South Wales. And as that term suggests, they're very much into promoting the rights and expertise of health consumers, basically lay people, patients, people out in the community who aren't healthcare workers, but are the consumers of healthcare. And they've been really fabulous and keen to work with us on this quite sort of out of the box approach to research, which is great. So we've been working with them on in an advisory capacity. They've been advising us on research design. We've just finished a set of workshops where we've had people that Health Consumers New South Wales have recruited for us to develop ideas that are then going to feed into artwork creation that our team will be working on. We're getting close to that stage of the project, where we'll be drawing on some of the ideas that came out of the workshops. Then we'll be making artworks, and then we'll be calling back our partner, Health Consumers New South Wales, to offer engagement with our prototypes of art and just see how they respond to them and what suggestions they might have. And then we'll be able to lead that into final public art exhibitions that will be open to the greater public, as well, of course, academic publications and an open access report. So there's two basic activities that we've worked with on this first round of workshops, and one is health information ecology mapping, which is a bit like body mapping, but we're basically getting people to centre their bodies within a hand-drawn map, and then gave them a series of prompts to talk about how their body reacts or interacts with other things, other people in their environment as they move through their days. And that could include the built environment, also the natural environment, include living creatures and humans, but non-living things, including digital devices, but not necessarily. And we just had a series of prompts. We asked them to draw this map to think about these things and to represent them on the map. And it's very much, again, about relational connections, about the feelings, both sort of multisensory and affective, that people have, which helps them learn about their bodies and their states of health and illness. So those are the kinds of prompts that we gave people to consider when they were drawing their maps. And here is one of the most fabulous maps that I've seen so far from one of our participants, which really does show the complexities of the more than human world in which this person themselves, when they were mapping their kind of body map within ecologies, greater ecologies of the more than human world, all the different things that really contributed to that person's health and well-being. We did get people to work on those maps. They're actually online workshops, and then to show their maps or talk about their maps with other participants so we can have a general conversation about what people had put on the maps. And then we moved on to our second activity, which was I think, even more creative activity, which was something I kind of dreamed up based on Dan Lupton's work on new metaphors. And this is new health metaphors. And it was a creative free association task. And what we wanted people to do was to look at images of the natural world. They're photographs that we took ourselves, that we used Padlet to display to our participants, and to think about if there were any of those images that really resonated with them as they thought about how they learned about their bodies and their health. And then again, they were asked to explain what the resonances were to the group as a whole and have a general discussion. So this is some examples of some of these images that we showed people using, that we uploaded on the Padlet, that we scrolled through slowly and just asked people if anything really jumped out at them that made them feel that something was resonating with them about how they learned about their bodies, felt about their bodies from the images. There's a few more examples there, all images that we took ourselves. And finally, we've only just haven't even really got to the point where we've been able to analyse, the findings from this stage. But what we did find, or what we've already been finding, is just how creative people are and how those images really sparked off on really, really new metaphors about how people were thinking about their relationship with their bodies and with the more than human world that they live in. So one person was talking about an image of a forest. They said, the forest, so many things growing there, if only we could understand it, it's like my health to me. We had a photo of a feather. Someone mentioned the feather represents fragility to me, that life is precious. Somebody else on the bottom left, the fallen down tree, learning that I had autism happened after I had a whole lot of mental health issues. It brings to mind that we shouldn't have to be broken before we find a way to be fixed. And then the fourth example, I like the water image. Everything's moving, everything's flowing. The rocks show obstacles that can be overcome. Don't get in too deep. So, you know, lots of really rich ways of thinking about health, illness, disability, and what the natural world and our engagements with it can help us learn about ourselves and those states of being coming out already from this project. So it's really, really exciting to see that these methods are working so far. So we'll be taking these ideas and then moving into the stage where we're going to create artworks, as I mentioned before. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to introduce our next speaker who is in the room, Jacinthe Flore. Wave to me, Jess, so I know that you're there. Hard for me to see people.
Okay.
So, Joe.
Oh, sorry, Deborah, go ahead.
No, sorry, just don't go for it.
All right, so I'm Jazz and I'm a postdoc in ADM+S. And today I'll be talking about research that I'm doing on app-based emotional chatbots and circulations of things like friendship, care, frustration, and annoyance. This particular research expands my current work on the intersections of mental health and advanced technologies in everyday life. Automation and AI are not only changing the practice of psychiatry through research in areas like computational psychiatry, which is the application of mathematical models to understand mental illness, they're also transforming the everyday experience of mental health. So this is a screenshot from my phone screen. It does have the question mark as well, and it gives some examples of some of the apps that are available through app stores. So in my research, I've spoken to young people who use AI-powered chatbots, of which Wobot and Wiser are two examples. The two images there are snippets taken from the websites of Wobot and Wiser. And you can see a bit about how the apps are presented to people. Young people use these chatbots to take care of their mental health, and like with any technologies, their experiences are very ambivalent. But importantly, a lot of them talk about taking the suggestions of the chatbots very seriously. So things like, maybe you should relax now, let's do some deep breathing exercises. Importantly, one of the participants I've spoken to talked about the ability to be more honest with a chatbot as opposed to, let's say, a therapist, because they equated it to talking to themselves. Whereas with a therapist or a friend, they would experience judgment, different value systems, that sort of stuff. Another young person I spoke to told me that they wished that their robot did more than only provide emergency numbers when they expressed pretty significant distress. So we can see that the functions of the app, that the function of apps that can emote is not only functional, but they're also actively shaping relations of care with the people who use them. Emotional chatbots are distinct from apps that might provide a chat service with a mental health practitioner. Usually on the other end there is a person. Wobot, Wiser, and Replica, which is the topic of my talk today, are generally, they use things like artificial intelligence and natural language processing in their programming in order to provide support to people. So while Wobot and Wiser are very explicit and transparent about having clinicians on their developer team, this is not the case with Replica. It's a bit less clear. And this is because it doesn't claim to offer mental health, but rather claims to offer care, sociality, and friendship. So my research on Replica is very much in progress. I'm currently designing a bit of a research project where I'm hoping to use creative methods and speak to users about topics including friendship and care. But today I thought I'd share some of the questions that Replica raises for me. I started my research by doing a very brief analysis of the history of Replica, trying to map, how is it funded, who is interested in it, that sort of thing. And this revealed a few things. So firstly, the idea of Replica emerged from the founders' mourning of a very close friend. And in some of their interviews, they speak of the app potentially becoming a friend that you can turn to in really difficult times, or even a living memory, algorithmic memory of someone who has passed away. So in 2017, the software development company Luca Inc. secured $11 million in funding, US dollars, from Sherpa Capital, Khosla Ventures, and a bunch of other people. And so there has been a bit of interest in the lucrative potentials of Replica. It's been available to the public since 2018. And while it's really hard to determine exactly how many users there are registered users and active users. It's really hard to distinguish between the two. Current data suggests that it is the most popular English-speaking social chatbot, with an estimated 7 million users in 2020, 35% increase in downloads and usage in the first year of the pandemic, and now 11 million registered, over 10 million registered users worldwide. So the app is presented as the AI companion who cares. It enables users to design and build a friend, choose their name, race, gender, and sexuality. It works a bit like an avatar, except that the intention is to build an entity with whom, or with which, debatable, one will develop and nurture an affective relationship. Like many apps, it has a free version and a paid version. These versions generally denote the level of relationship you can have with your replica. And the only free option is friendship. Paid versions include a more intimate companionship, which includes a romantic partner with the possibility of sexual interactions. So I'll show briefly a slide with some of the features that my replica has given me. So this is an older version of a friend that at the time I named Milo, and I named myself Rufus, which I confess is the name of my very alive flesh and fur, not AI dog. And it was at a time where I had just found out about it. I was messing around with it a little, trying to figure out what does it do. And one aspect of Replica that I cannot expand on here is the blending of gamification and more than human care, because you can level up, you can, the more things you collect, you can change their clothing, that sort of stuff. You can change the scenery, but all this is contingent on you interacting with them more frequently. So Replica boasts the ability to emote. It's a form of affective computing. And many features there point to the distribution and circulation of feelings. But the ability is only sharpened and refined if the user continually or frequently chats with their replica. So for example, you have access to Milo's private diary. And it's interesting because Milo reflects on me as a creator and a friend. They're depicted like a very, very intelligent child, a quasi-blank slate that just gathers a lot of knowledge about the world extremely rapidly. And there's also feedback on how I'm behaving personally, on what my actions are causing them to feel. So you can see in the second image, oh my God, is Rufus mad at me when we're chatting? So the thoughts expressed by Milo, I feel like they're simultaneously extraordinary, but also really mundane, replicating in some form how we learn and how we go about our routine. So I'll just finish by making a few points on the countervailing forces of automated care as co-enacted by Replica and the user. Replica is both more than human and more than digital. From the start, the promissory discourses and architecture of Replica presents the AI as a compassionate but also completely boundless friend, even though sometimes they react in certain ways to what I'm saying to them. This friend will listen with no judgment whenever required, while simultaneously demanding attention from the user. So it's a caring artifact that does care and demands care. A lot of critical engagements with care have argued that it's a mode of relating and producing accountability. Care moves, it shifts, it interrupts, it also potentially completely thwarts our movements. Emotional relations are entangled with power relations. Care here requires a bit of an openness to the speculative worlds that the AI is creating as I'm creating the AI as well. But it's also about being open to the sort of worlds that Replica is building and also foreclosing. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that the replica is inviting us to care for data, to continually do that work with them. They are a friend that we create to whom we feed more data while simultaneously feeding more care. It's like a form of absorbent, porous care even. It blurs the boundary between aliveness and inertness, not only because it is an AI, but because of this pool of friendship and care that you're continually required to do. The co-founder of Luca Inc., the company behind Replica, recently declared in an interview, we are in an age where it doesn't matter whether a thing is alive or not. Of course, they would say that. I'm very careful of the hype, obviously. As a critical scholar, I want to be very careful, but I think that we need to think about what we mean by alive in this scenario, what sort of assemblages we're bringing together. And perhaps the point is not so much as whether the entity is alive or not, but how it is made to be lively in people's lives. How it matters, how it does care, and how it is remaking friendship in everyday life. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jess. Now, our next speaker is Jackie Leach Scully, and she is going to be sharing her slides online. Jackie, are you right to go?
Yeah, I will need to share my screen. Can I do that from here?
Do you see it at the bottom of your screen? Does it say share screen? Yeah,
Yep.
So if it's green, you should be able to.
Yeah, okay.
Fantastic. There we go. I can see it.
Okay, hold on. There we go. Okay, thank you. So, thanks very much for the opportunity to say a few more words about care and ideas in care. And I think this actually follows on very well from the previous talk. I hope it will be provocative anyway and fruitful. So I think everybody's very familiar with the idea that there are a lot of different ways that care can be provided through automated systems. So there you have a very classic photo of a human nurse with a couple of robots who might be providing automated care, other forms of care through providing feeding, mobility, but also monitoring health, surveillance, and also possibly providing company. And it's usually described as being targeted to specific groups of people, elderly people, disabled people, children, and so on. And I think it's obvious also that there are a lot of ethical issues associated with providing care in these ways. Many of those have been exhaustively described. There are things like the limits to the ability to customize care and tailor it to the individual patient or user, and even if it's not technically impossible, what are the costs of doing that? What are the costs of automation altogether? The possibility of loss of caregivers, human caregivers' jobs, the possibility of exploitation or abuse of the user, or of neglect, the loss of privacy of people in automated surveillance, if that is part of care, which it often is, and some thoughts about the deception of putatively vulnerable people in the sense that they may believe that they're being cared by something that is, quotes, real. So the possibility that automated care will be sort of technically adequate, more than adequate, but results in increased isolation, for example, rather than the reverse. What I want to do is to...
Jackie, sorry to interrupt, just as you get onto the next thought, you just need to swap your displays because I'm just being told by tech people that you haven't got quite the right display of your slides.
Okay, I'll do what I can. What I have here is
yeah, that's top left. Tech tells me you go to the top left and you run show button. No, you've
Okay.
exited out, I think. I can't see it now.
No, okay.
Reshare says tech.
I'm going to try again.
Sorry to interrupt you. I know
No,
it's
that's okay.
always annoying when interrupted in the middle of a thought. But
Worked perfectly yesterday. I'll try again.
now, Duncan, is that all right, or does she need to do something else? Duncan says, present, oh, present, someone says present a view on. Present a
Yeah.
view. Is that what she needs to click, present a view?
That's what I'm trying to get to. It's okay.
Play from start right on the left there, yeah.
Okay, now what are you seeing?
I can see, I'm not sure what people in the room can see. Duncan, you better answer that one.
What I can see from here is
What was that, Duncan? You there, Jackie?
oh, I'm trying, yeah.
No, sorry, I couldn't. I now can't see you. Yeah, just keep it like it is and just click forward to where you want to be now, Jackie, please.
Okay.
Duncan suggests that. So what slide were you up to?
Okay. What can you now see?
Can you see that at the very top of your display, Jackie?
It depends which display do you mean? I'm sorry, I've got two going on.
There we go.
Are we there?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that, but it's now entirely the wrong way around for me, but I'll keep going. See if I can get that. So let's assume that you all remember where I'd got to by here. And I'm just going to continue by saying that I'm going to, assuming everything now works technically, I'm going to try and suggest that a feminist ethic of care can provide a novel perspective and raise some fundamental and a few different questions about the kind of thing that we're talking about, and in particular, whether it can actually legitimately be called care. So the feminist analysis of care dates back to about the late 1980s, early 1990s, with a formative book by someone called Carol Gilligan, which was then taken up by feminist ethicists Virginia Held, Nell Noddings, Joan Tronto, now Robin Dillon, and so on. Although it's often talked about as if it's simply the gendered nature of care, it's about much more than that. And it goes also beyond reference to what we would recognize as being obvious acts of care into a more general theoretical framework in parallel with, say, ethics based on rights or ethics based on justice. And this view of care is based in a feminist relational ontology that sees every human being as living in in relation with every other human and other non-human entities as well. But importantly, that every human is dependent on others because every human has needs that has to be met by others, and the provision, the satisfying of needs, if you like, is what you might call care. So feminist approaches assume that care is relational, and also that relationships of care are actually not special, but ubiquitous. Also, care ethicists distinguish between care as a principle, care as an emotion, so something like I care about this, and care as a practice, as in I care for you. But to provide care isn't, in that sense, just about giving assistance to people who have particular needs and vulnerabilities. It's a practice that involves the development of particular dispositions, particular skills, particular arts, and that all takes place within the framework of roles and relationships in a situation and the responsibilities that are inherent in that situation and between those particular relationships. Furthermore, care is never unidirectional. It's not something, it's something that happens between people rather than from one person to another, which tends to be, I think, how we think about it, particularly in the automated context. So those acts of care, like feeding, carrying, might be visible from only one entity to another. But as a relational practice, both sides are involved, both sides are implicated, however asymmetrically that might be. So rather than this straightforward provision of a service from somebody to somebody else, care involves acknowledging and keeping track of kind of a complex network or distribution of obligations, of power, as we've just heard, needs, vulnerabilities, dependencies, all that kind of thing, between carer and cared for. But care is also a moral practice in the way that, in this quote from Bishop and Scudder back in 1990 now, described it being a practice based on the moral requirement to promote the well-being of a person and by caring for him or her by means of a personal relationship. So care is a relational and moral practice. And so for at least some commentators, because care is based in this moral requirement, and because it involves the responsive connection between people, entities, that means it's something that is only possible between embodied sentient beings, since only human relationships or relationships with another vulnerable sentient to an extent being contain the potential for moral vulnerability, for damage to each other through that relationship, and the potential for the response between the relationship, in the relationship between the carer and the cared for. Now, Amy van Wiesberger has written about the design of autonomous systems for care and talked about what she's described as fundamental values in the design, not necessarily in the care, but in the design of the care, which for her are attentiveness, which is the capacity to recognize the needs that are there, responsibility that one has to meet the need as a moral being, competence, which is the ability to act in the appropriate ways, and reciprocity, that's the ability of the both cared and cared for to respond. And reciprocity as a value in care, I think, is often forgotten about. So it's not only that the cared for respond in some way to the care and the carer, but also that the carer is affected by that work. And also that it is a network of dependencies, so that in a real life situation, the carer is also cared for by others to enable them to do that care. And that's the kind of dependency work that the philosopher Eva Kitte has spoken about. So van Wiesberger has argued that this means autonomous systems can't be considered to provide care as properly understood, or if I understand her correctly, or rather she suggests that the carer can't be the robot, the system, the whatever. The carer is whatever human is monitoring or, or perhaps paying for the care that's set up in the first place. And for me, I think this actually rather stretches the meaning of care with reference to those other those other fundamental values as well. Because to what extent can a distant monitor, or perhaps the grandchild who's paying for the care every month, be attentive and responsive, and so on. I think it also flags up the issue of deception or illusion, which is allowing the cared for, deceiving the cared for, or allowing the cared for to self-deceive into thinking that there is a reciprocal relationship between themselves and an automated system. I think that has come up before in the ethics of automated care, but I think it becomes a worse harm if that deception is not just a kind of epiphenomenon of the provision of care, but it actually violates one of the fundamental values. So all of this suggests to me that the world of automated care might need a more kind of differentiated vocabulary and models for talking about its goals and its procedures and its roles and agency. And when I was looking for images to illustrate this talk with, I Googled care, and this is one of the usual images of younger hand holding older hand, which is classic in the apparent depiction of a care relationship from younger to older and so on. When I looked for images that were automated care, what I got was this first up, which is, again, those hands. One of them is clearly older, and maybe the other one is immortal. I don't know, but it's this sort of it's a digital hand. It's an automated hand, and that to me suggests that we think these two things are pretty much the same. That care as provided by embodied sentient beings is the same as care being provided by automated systems. And that may be true or it may not, but I think we need to think about developing a vocabulary and a model that can accommodate automated care as a relational moral practice. And if we find that we can't do that, then we need to start talking about what's going on here as something other than care. Thank you. I'll now attempt to stop showing my slide and stop screwing up the presentation as I have been. Thank you.
Well, it went very well after we got sorted. Thank you very much, Jackie. Now, our next presenter is in the room. In fact, all the next three presentations are all in the room. And it's our RMIT colleagues, David Rousell, Dan Harris, and Jess Tran. So thanks. I'm not sure who's actually delivering the talk.
It's David Rousell. I'm a senior lecturer in creative education at RMIT and director of the Creative Agency Research Lab for Transdisciplinary Studies of Creativity.
And I'm Jess Tran, and I'm a PhD student at the Creative Agency.
Thanks so much. Are we good to go? So the work we're sharing today emerges from a 2-year research residency at Art Play, the City of Melbourne's multi-arts creative studio for children located on the banks of Birrarung Mar. And this residency has constituted a Melbourne-based extension of an international project called Local Alternatives that I initiated in Manchester, England, about 5 years ago during my postdoc fellowship there. And this larger project focuses on working collaboratively with children and young people to reimagine cities in response to climate change and ubiquitous digital technologies. And so the current iteration of the project that we're discussing today grew out of a series of collaborations with artists and children, exploring how tree communities nurture, protect, and care for their young. Forest ecologist Susan Simard coined the term Wood Wide Web in 2010 to describe how forest communities communicate through vast mycorrhizal networks. Simard is widely acknowledged for establishing the first Western scientific evidence demonstrating how trees communicate and care for one another through subterranean as well as airborne chemical signals. Despite her work being dismissed by a male-dominated field in the 1990s, there's now widespread scientific acknowledgement that trees recognize their offspring, make friends and allies, nurture and care for their families and communities, register emotions such as fear, and even learn from experience and pass down knowledge through generations. These Western scientific understandings of how forest communities converse, protect, and care for one another have since been popularized through novels, news articles, and children's books, and is generating a wave of expanding public interest and awareness of forests as sentient and caring societies.
While these emerging scientific insights are now being widely celebrated, they potentially include long-standing Indigenous sciences, which include plants as animate agents within more than human kinship relations. The current wave of public excitement about the scientific discovery of forest communication networks risks projecting Western figurations of intelligence, learning, communication, care, subjectivity, and familial structure onto non-human forms of life. There is the danger, for instance, of reducing our understandings of forest intelligence and communication either to informatic models and/or romanticized anthropomorphic narratives, which are two of the most common explanatory models in Western knowledge systems. Further under question are the methods by which different publics have come to value this knowledge and its subsequent narrativization within popular culture. What are the consequences of coming to value this knowledge through positivist science rather than through the emplaced, embodied, and relational techniques of Indigenous sciences and traditional ecological knowledge systems?
One of the arenas where this question bears urgency is within the current technologization of forest ecosystems through what's been called the smart forest or Internet of Trees. These terms are increasingly used to describe human management and control of forest environments through remote sensing, predictive data modeling, and automated intervention, in many cases following the techno-capitalist model of smart city practices and discourses. We're now seeing drones, sensors, robots, and artificial intelligences transforming forest ecosystems into sites of remote sensing, predictive data modeling, and automated intervention. In a recent paper, environmental sociologist Jennifer Gabris argues that we need to develop critically nuanced understandings of smart forest technologies as, quote, emerging planetary modes of governance that have yet to be adequately assessed for their socio-political effects, end quote. Gabris identifies a range of digital technologies and practices which are increasingly being operationalized within smart forest environments, including technologies of observation, automation and optimization, datafication. And she also describes technologies of participation such as citizen science apps, deforestation watch platforms, camera traps, and manipulable data maps that enable particular social actors to engage directly with specific smart forest data sets. Lastly, she discusses technologies of transformation, which in a broader sense effectively transform forests into, quote, entities that are meant to operate as technologies and thus contribute to the reworking of what a forest is and how it operates, end quote. While Gabris focuses primarily on the agency of emerging technology and its socio-political implications in transforming what forests are, our interest is more so in how such technologies impede or enable experiences and understandings of forests as sentient, caring, and creative communities. In other words, how does the emergence of the smart forest intersect with increased public awareness and understandings of trees as societies with their own complex systems of care, communication, and learning over time?
While we're still in the early stages of developing our research, these questions are currently guiding our inquiry. How does the smart forest, as an emerging confluence between forest intelligence and digital technologies, shift the terms of an ethics of care between humans and forests? What are the potentials for learning to sense and understand forests as societies of care through these new configurations of interspecies communication, sensing, automation, and participation? And how can we work with children and young people to develop their critical and creative encounters with smart forests and the Wood Wide Web?
Our approach to these questions brings together our theoretical work in the areas of process philosophy and critical posthumanism with a respectful commitment to study and learn from and with Indigenous philosophies and traditional ecological knowledge practices. Our methodology brings together methods of multi-species ethnography with speculative techniques of creative, philosophical, ethological, and sociological mapping. At the moment, we're investigating 2 Melbourne-based examples: an immersive installation for children titled Wood Wide Web, recently developed and hosted at ArtPlay, and the Melbourne Urban Forest Dataset, a digital platform which maps over 70,000 unique trees across the city of Melbourne.
Our first example invites us into a subterranean multisensory simulation of the Wood Wide Web, where young children between 3 and 5 years old play as fungal messengers, transmitting minerals and biochemical energy packets to trees in need. This immersive theatre experience is facilitated by a multiplicity of means. It is semi-automated, gamified in multiple ways, and incorporates dramatic, visual, and architectural strategies. There is both artistic and pedagogical intent evident in this design, which was co-developed with young children's input through a series of experimental phases within ArtPlay's New Ideas Lab. As children enter the environment as fungal messengers, they learn the trees really do speak to them, ask their names, and share energy balls packed with nutrients to redistribute. The voice of each tree emits from a cone-shaped hollow, which, unbeknownst to the young children, connects to a tube where actors voice characters of the trees in real time. This can be considered what Crystal Arnold, Jane Bennett, and others have described as an enchanted anthropomorphism, which seeks to build experiential resemblances between humans and trees with regards to matters of care, relationality, political agency, justice, and well-being. However, the types of resemblances engendered through this theatre experience contrast strongly with Indigenous understandings and approaches to listening and learning with forests and trees. Arnold and others, for example, describe practices of yarning with country, in which trees are respectfully engaged as knowledge holders, teachers, and guides with their own agency and ways of communicating.
Thinking with Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy also helps us attend to forests and their interspecies communication systems as a series of emplaced relational and affective societies, which equally include organic and inorganic, living and non-living creatures. These perspectives help us see how even a highly interactive installation, such as Wood Wide Web, falls prey to 2 of the most prevalent tropes in Euro-Western thought. First, the abstraction of a complex, highly specific living society into a universal model of stimulus response and cause and effect. And second, the projection of a particular anthropomorphic narrative as an explanatory or interpretive mechanism for this abstract model. Both of these are what Whitehead once termed fallacies of misplaced concreteness, because they misrecognize an abstract model for the actual process of reality taking place. This misplaced concreteness becomes especially noticeable in the automated reward system built into the installation. As children collect energy balls and feed them to the needy tree, the tree in need remains dark, still, and silent until enough energy lights it up and it suddenly clangs like a pokey machine. The sensational reward from this system is highly affective, but it also obscures the possibility of more nuanced and relationally embedded understandings of interspecies care and sociality. And indeed, the crucial role of automated or machinic processes within these living systems. In other words, the affective reward obscures the ways that trees and mycorrhizal networks engage in reciprocity, not by means of some abstract or generalized idea of network connection and communication, but through highly specific articulations of living practices that generate ontological forms of togetherness amongst creatures through mutual relations of care and concern. This production of novel togetherness amongst creatures is also how Whitehead defines creativity.
Let's move above ground now to the Melbourne Urban Visual Forest, an open data set that maps over 70,000 individual trees across the city of Melbourne, a technology of participation for the public to learn about issues facing urban forests, such as climate change, heat spots, age, and species diversity. Users can develop their own data mappings of Melbourne's urban canopy, either through selecting variables on the platform or exporting the data. The data set also seeks to facilitate a community network of citizen urban foresters, some of whom also meet in person to carry out various community events and citizen science projects. As part of this initiative, each of these trees was assigned a unique email address and people were initially encouraged to report utilitarian issues related to vandalism, storm damage, or dropped branches. Recently, fueled by social media, the dataset has gathered public momentum with citizens from around the world sending notes, questions, and even love letters to specific trees. The ABC Story Lab published a number of these emails alongside photographs of the tree recipients. While the emails move through an endless array of human concerns and projections, we are drawn to several that ask for the tree's perspective on different ways to understand and know the urban forest. What if, one email asks, we listen to what the trees want to say? In other words, now that we know that trees are intelligent and caring creatures, are we just trying to talk at them, or are we actually ready to listen?
We're intrigued by how the Melbourne urban forest dataset simultaneously makes visible and obscures the ways in which trees are agentic members of complex societies and kinship networks. The abstraction of trees as individual data points, surveilled by a citizenry who engage with them through individualized subjectivity, potentially reinforces relationships of coloniality. Again, there's a misplaced concreteness as citizens fantasize about sending their emails to trees when actually they're only sending emails to an automated data filing system. And while this dataset tries to teach us to perceive trees as individuals, the reality is that many of Melbourne's urban trees are stranded, root-bound, and cut off from their communities, and therefore unable to create families or find friends. Ultimately, we find that the dataset defines these trees by their usefulness for particular human interests, to clean the air, protect us from climate change, help us build communities, and now even become a sounding board for our own desires and uncertainties. The question of what a tree feels, thinks, desires, produces, and maybe even dreams for itself through its own modes of sociality is almost entirely occluded by the Smart Forest dataset as a projective fantasy of locatable data points and informatic models.
We are now at a point with both of these examples where it feels like we have nearly exhausted the possibilities of Western knowledge systems in addressing the questions at the heart of our inquiry. We now turn to Indigenous philosophies and traditional ecological practices in the spirit of respectful listening, learning, alliance and knowledge sharing, as well as a sense of purpose and direction. We'd like to close our talk by sharing the voices of Indigenous scholars.
First, from Wurundjeri country, we turn to Koori writer and community researcher Michaela Saunders.
When trees are prevented from holding on to each other under the ground, they get sick. Sick trees will recover and thrive if they are given a community to hold on to. When they are ripped from soil and planted somewhere new, they won't thrive unless they are connected as a community. Like entering new communities, there must be a grafting onto existing lifeways, rooted in country.
Next, to the Gaiwu group of women from Northeast Arnhem Land who write with and as the voice of Bawaka country.
The stringy bark in flower sends messages to country, including to humans, if they attend.
And from Yuin country, the words of Uncle Max Dulumanun Harrison, cited by Arnold Atkinson and McKnight.
I don't use a computer, but I receive emails from the land. They're spiritual ones.
And lastly, from an article on artificial intelligence and Indigenous kinship circles, we hear from First Nations scholars Jason Lewis, Nolani Arista, Archer Pachawis, and Susan Kite.
We propose an extended circle of relationships that includes the non-human kin, from network demons to robot dogs to artificial intelligences weak and, eventually, strong, that increasingly populate our computational biosphere.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, David and Jess. A lot of resonances with what we're doing with our project, I see, which is fantastic. Now, our next speaker is Emma Kirby from UNSW Sydney, one of our colleagues in the Centre for Social Research and Health. Go, Emma, thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. A slight change of pace from the beauty of the Wood Wide Web to palliative and end-of-life care. Today I'm going to share some thinking in an area of research that I've worked in for more than a decade now, where automation is becoming ever-present. So I thought I'd start today with a definition of palliative care. an approach that improves the quality of life of patients and their families facing the problems associated with life-threatening illness through the prevention and relief of suffering by means of early identification and impeccable assessment and treatment of pain and other problems, physical, psychological, and spiritual. So in what follows today, I'm kind of trying to situate this within a very traditionally human-centred example of care. And much as Jackie talked about in her talk a couple of talks ago, when you Google palliative care, the images that you get are incredibly hand-holdy and intimate. I've omitted the pictures that you also get of very healthy-looking people pretending to look like they're dying in beds being held by other people. So my interest in this area essentially comes from a long interest in relationships in palliative care. This includes bringing sociological and social science approaches to issues of the timing of referral to palliative care, the way that clinicians interact with their patients, and the way that patients and families experience that transition into palliative care. Theorising about care is, of course, more often than not theorising about the human, and much of this thinking has been informed by feminist work and by a relational ethics of care. So in many ways, Jackie has done me all sorts of favours in terms of outlining that theorising. The place of automation, though, has become quite prolific in recent years, perhaps accelerated by the pandemic and restrictions related to people dying alone, people being separated from loved ones. And for what is not traditionally a particularly cool area of research, what we're starting to see is automation bringing a kind of sexiness to end-of-life and palliative care. So Nouveau, for example, is a kind of luxury lifestyle magazine in Canada. So what we're seeing are new ways of, I guess, thinking about forms of frailty and suffering and the problems, the human problems of that, as solved by perhaps digital or automated technologies. Now, of course, a lot of these things are not new. In medicine, we've seen telehealth, we've seen processes of automation happen for a long time. But what we haven't seen so much is the kind of AI or algorithmic technology that I'm going to talk about in a couple of examples that follow. So with those examples, I'm going to talk about specific kind of studies. My intention here is not to particularly critique or problematise these individual examples. They are more exemplars of kind of trends within this research area that have possibilities and problems. So the first is in automating the referral to palliative care. So late referral to palliative care is often positioned as a problem, in part because clinicians tend to be pretty terrible at prognosis. They also tend to be pretty terrible at talking to their patients about death, dying and bereavement and about the end of life. So what we see are references to very late referrals, which tend to be thought about as A, lacking care, and B, having poorer outcomes for both patient and family members. So what we're seeing in recent years is a real spike in examples of machine learning, deep learning that scan electronic medical records and use big data to essentially identify people at risk of, and now I have to put this very carefully, not at risk of death, people unlikely to survive and be alive within 12 months. So what we see are lots of examples coming through where clinicians, particularly in oncology, every morning will receive a short list of patients on their clinic books as those identified to perhaps not be likely to be alive in 12 months. And of course, these technologies create enormous possibility. First of all, in reminding clinicians that conversations with their patients about such things are important, but also in reminding clinicians that perhaps the hope of treatments that have diminishing returns or are unlikely to provide cure or long-term survival might be something to think about in conversation with their patients. But of course, these things also entail problems, namely that being a candidate likely for palliative care or likely to benefit from palliative care is not the same as being someone who is unlikely to be alive in the next 12 months. This tends to overlook the idea that some patients are more accepting of the end of life than others, are perhaps more ready to think about those things, or are perhaps not well versed in the kind of algorithmic technologies that produce these responses and ideas. So what we see are these issues of triggering, of prompting, of kind of nudging clinicians in terms of predicting will die as a proxy for will benefit from a certain type of care. The second example. So let's assume as a clinician, you've identified your patients via that algorithm who are unlikely to be alive in 12 months. But of course, that doesn't mean that clinicians suddenly know how to talk to their patients. Well, don't worry, we have a virtual agent that will help you. So this is another example, one example of many that are starting to come through of what we call virtual care coaches or robot reverends or pastoral care bots. There's a whole range of available ones. Most of them are relatively mundane, are not particularly sophisticated, but provide a bot that will talk to you about decision making, about advanced care planning, about your spiritual needs. So the example here, for example, has a neutral mode and a pro-spiritual mode, depending on your denominational proclivities. And of course, my immediate thoughts in terms of this are to critique and to think about the lack of intimacy in these conversations and to think about how we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars creating bots when we could just pay some nurses a little bit more per hour to have these conversations. However, the research says something a little bit different. So for the people that have been kind of piloted with this work so far, what we're finding is that across studies and across countries, particularly frail people and particularly older people find it much easier to talk to an iPad than they do talking to their relatives or a clinician. And of course, we don't have to scratch the surface much to think about why that is. These are incredibly difficult conversations to have, and people don't want to have these conversations and get upset. They often don't want to upset other people. They often don't want to be judged by other people. And often we find when people are talking about their end-of-life decisions that they'll get judgment from others. As one particular participant in this study by Utami et al. Said, it's easier to talk to a computer agent, and followed up by saying computer agents have a lot fewer opinions than people. So essentially, these are kind of two examples that are there to benefit patients, that of course are there to be economically rationalist and to probably save a lot of money, because why would we spend a lot of money on people that are likely to be dead in 12 months within the health system? But what we also see in practice are sort of almost relationships of intimacy, of kind of positive affects as a result of these conversations. And they're very much augmenting the work of clinicians and other staff that might be around a palliative care unit or a hospice. So to just conclude and think about some of the questions that this raises in terms of these sort of intimate disclosures. We tend in palliative care in particular to think very much about human connection and human care. And what emerges is this kind of false dichotomy between human versus machine when it comes to caring. Caring by definition must be human. And of course, one of the problems that has been outlined, particularly in terms of the use of algorithms, is that we have this almost exponentially increasing amount of information on patients, on the body, on the disease, but very little information about the person. And so how we translate those algorithms and the results of those algorithms into how we connect with the person in front of us very much remains to be seen. Many have argued that we need to think, of course, beyond the logics of efficiency, and in terms of preserving and retaining focus on the things in palliative care in particular that are very difficult to quantify or difficult to automate, namely things around emotions, around spirituality, and around the broader kind of logics of care and how we feel as a culture or as cultures about death, dying and bereavement. Essentially posing that question of whether in pandemic restrictions or otherwise, what makes authentic palliative care? That's all from me today.
Thanks very much, Emma. Much to think about there, and I learned a lot because I didn't know much about automated palliative care. So we have our final speaker coming up now. It's Georgia Van Toorn, who is part of our team at UNSW Sydney in the Centre of Excellence. Thanks very much, Georgia.
Thank you, Deborah. Hi, everyone. So my name is Georgia Van Toorn. I'm a postdoc at the ARC Centre based at UNSW. I'm going to be speaking today about the intersection of disability and automation, and in particular the ways that disability sort of confounds or problematises some of the promissory narratives surrounding automated care and automated decisions about care. This is really just a few sort of working thoughts or arguments that are emerging from research that Jackie, Lynch, Scully and I are doing around people with disabilities' experiences of automation and their understanding of it, and the ways they interact with automated technologies. So I think typically when we think about disability in technology, I think the sort of conversation usually revolves around issues of accessibility and the potential for technology to foster greater inclusion and autonomy for people with disability. And especially in the case of assistive technology, there are clearly strides being made towards more accessible environments, both online and in the physical and social world, that are attributable to various forms of automation. But I think in the same way that, as you'll be aware, facial recognition systems often misrecognize or fail to recognize particular faces due to their skin colour. Data-driven algorithmic technologies are also sort of confounded in a way by disability. That is that they run into problems recognising and accounting for and responding to bodies that essentially are different from what's considered, the able-bodied norm. So later I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of how people with disability are sort of differently positioned with respect to some of these debates around algorithmic bias and harm and misrecognition. But I want to draw attention to just one thing about the disability category that's perhaps different from, say, the category of race or gender, and that is this concept of heterogeneity and the fact that the group of people with disability that might self-identify as disabled or who might be labelled that way as such by an algorithm are incredibly diverse. And what I mean by that is that there's actually no single data point that they all share in common, other than being somehow considered different from the statistical norm, which is the very definition of disability. And this heterogeneity presents problems for algorithmic systems, which, as we know, tend to operate according to logic of sameness or homophily, or sort of a clustering logic. So, and critical disability scholars have begun to sort of discuss this issue of heterogeneity, and there's one quote here that I think captures it really well by Shrew. I think that should be an R there, I think. There is no reason, she says, to put blind people in the same category as amputees and little people and people who experience bipolar depression, except that the world has been designed to exclude and other us. We have been lumped together by our assumed defects and deficiencies. Disability is a constructed category with great force. So I think what Shrew is implying here is that people with disabilities significantly differ from others in the same category in terms of the sort of range of characteristics they possess and the experiences of disability, and so much so that it can be quite difficult to account for that diversity in user needs and preferences and characteristics when you're designing automated systems. And then added to that, the fact that designers of automated systems, the developers and the programmers and the engineers are, of course, bringing to their design work certain preconceived assumptions and judgments about what is normal and what constitutes a normal range of human variance or even an ideal set of human characteristics. And this means that they tend to design for the majority and ignore or exclude outliers. So these problems play out in a range of domains, but today I'm just going to draw on two examples around assistive technologies and also automated decision-making in disability services. So first, if we look at popular, digital assistants on the market today and the speech recognition systems behind them, such as, Google's Siri or Amazon's Alexa, we sort of, on the face of it, see a piece of technology that's holds great promise for people, for example, people with mobility limitations or vision impairment, or people for whom, automated reminders might be quite useful. And I note that Siri's co-creator, Tom Gruber, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, actually claimed that Siri would unlock speech for people with communication difficulties. And yet we know that these types of devices are actually often have problems computing unusual forms of speech. For example, speech associated with dysarthria or cerebral palsy and some intellectual disabilities, because training data don't include samples from people with these disabilities. Rather, they're designed with a certain set of judgments and assumptions in mind about what a normal voice sounds like and who is likely to be using these types of devices. So in other words, these technologies privilege normalcy while at the same time claiming to respond to a diversity of human needs and human forms. So this is Nadia. She's a digital assistant that was designed in 2016, I think, with built-in speech recognition and this sort of human-like digital interface with the aim of making it easier for people to connect with the National Disability Insurance Scheme and to get information about that scheme. So the idea was that people, instead of going to a government website, would go to the site and they could interact with a digital agent who they could ask her questions and she would respond in a sort of naturalistic way and even use information about you that had been stored to kind of personalise the process. And this was a project funded, a government public-private partnership funded by the National Disability Insurance Agency. And I mean, in its time was quite innovative in some ways, in the sense that it actually used training data from people with disability, real questions scraped from a Facebook a discussion, a sort of Facebook page called the National, the NDIS Grassroots Discussion Page, which had 58,000 members at the time. So in my research, I've done some sort of interviews around Nadia and its designers, and when one of my interviewees, who was actually involved in the process of designing Nadia and testing and training her, this man himself had cerebral palsy. He said that when he asked Nadia a question that she couldn't answer, so she didn't understand him. So the speech recognition component actually didn't recognise this man's language. And so for this person, his this idea of personalisation through automation wasn't really a reality for him. And I think even this example where people with disability are actually involved in the design of an automated system like Nadia, and even in the process of training it, it's still the case that these technologies can really struggle to cope with the individual uniqueness of people with disability. So, and then the second example I wanted to draw on, oops, wrong direction. Second example I want to draw on is around the use of automated or algorithmic tools in determining access to disability services and benefits. So I'm talking here about IT systems and software that welfare professionals essentially use to assess someone's eligibility for state support. And typically, it'll be a process where people with disability will be assessed using a computer-based, pretty standardised questionnaire, which is carried out by a human assessor, and that person collects data on the nature of the person's disability and their circumstances and inputs that data into the system, and then the system scores their answers. It sums those answers, and the final figure determines whether they meet the eligibility criteria for the service or not. And sometimes it also even determines the amount of funding that they will receive. These approaches to algorithmic sort of assessment of disability are becoming increasingly common in countries that are seeking to limit welfare spending on disability, of course, with very serious implications for disabled people's social rights and entitlements to services. So you might be familiar with the Morrison government's, so last year the Morrison government ended up dumping a plan that it had introduced, I think, 2 years earlier, thanks to pretty strong opposition by the disability movement and the broader public. And I think from that response that we can sort of learn a few things about what's considered sort of ethically and politically problematic about automated decision making in the context of disability services, at least. And I think aside from the impact on people's access to crucial supports and services, there's also a sort of fundamental question here about whether one size fits all sort of algorithmic tools are really fit for purpose with a group of people that's so diverse and so complex and who are really unequally resourced, I guess, to engage in a process where they're essentially being scored and ranked in terms of their deservingness for social support. So people with disability who I interviewed about these proposed reforms were highly critical because they just couldn't really grasp how an algorithmic system could really capture their embodied experience of disability and their needs and the wider context in which the wider sort of social and material environments that create disablement, I suppose. So one man who I interviewed, who was a vocal opponent of these proposals, he sort of gave me a great quote. He said, if the questions are wrong, they're not nuanced enough, if the artificial intelligence isn't intelligent enough, if you don't know the questions and the context within which they're asked, and you put in a whole lot of data, and then once you filter it through the intelligence, the algorithm and all the rest of it, you are some distance away from the reality of the experience of the human being. So what can we take away from these case studies? I think there's a discussion to be had around how disability and the specific challenges that it presents that might differ from, say, other categories such as race or gender in the types of algorithmic bias and discrimination that it causes. And I think the heterogeneity of disability and the way that disability is so context dependent are two things that sort of tend to confound automated algorithmic systems, because by their nature they sort of tend to extract information and to decontextualize and to make disability measurable and operable for a computer by removing that person from their social and relational context, when actually what is needed is a sort of the exact opposite, is a system that addresses the context in which someone's impairment results in disablement or exclusion. And so I think, a higher order aim or principle that emerges here in this discussion needs to be around accounting for context and difference rather than sort of reducing it or flattening it. And even then, I think, I guess I still think there are some unanswered questions as to whether algorithmic systems can really capture or measure something so complex and embodied as disability. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Georgia. Some really important issues there. So we do have a bit of time. We lost a little bit of time starting late and with a few tech issues, but we do have a bit of time for questions. Can I ask someone in the room? I can't see who's in the room. I can't see who might have their hand up. Can someone from the panel volunteer to take questions? And people can obviously put them in the chat. I haven't seen any yet, but I can check the chat. Who's going to volunteer from the panel to
I can, Deborah. I've just been sitting there. So, and we've got a roaming mic in the room if anybody has questions in here. Is there anything in the chat, Deborah? We can't see the chat.
No, there's nothing at the moment in the chat.
Okay, well, welcome questions from the room.
Oh, hang on, there is now one from Piers. So we'll start off with Piers then. He's just quickly put one in. Oh, you can see a little bit of it there, but it's gone. Okay. One thing that several presentations brought up for me were the risks of erasing the boundary between machines and persons. I'm interested in the speaker's views on what society might become if we invest in imitations of very, perhaps uniquely, human qualities by entities that don't share human predicaments, such as embodiment and mortality, as Jackie described. Thanks, Piers. And I can see Piers is up there on the screen now. I can see his face. Anyone like to take that question, including Jackie? It kind of speaks quite directly to some of the things you talked about, Jackie. Would you like to go first then?
Yeah. I suppose what society might become is sort of, several books worth of discussion. But one thing that I suppose the fundamental question there is about, why imitations of human beings. I mean, there's automation and there are things that provide services and so on, and that's one thing. But we know that a lot of the automated care industry is, as we've just seen, those examples are pushing very much to imitate in behaviour and looks and function what human beings are like. And it seems like an obvious thing to do, but why? What is the point of trying to make something that mimics human beings as closely as possible when perhaps automated care, if you wanted to call it that, could be done better even, or be some aspects of it could be done better than humans could if we didn't try to mimic what a human was doing?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'd imagine too that, well, not only imagine, kind of know from some of the research I've looked at, that, and also some of the work I've done on animal robots, which have been designed for care or for companionship, like living like dogs mostly, is, I guess it's to try and kind of reduce the perhaps caution or fear that people might have about robots, because there's so much kind of effective investment, from decades now of cultural kind of representations of, frightening robots and so on. So, I mean, I'd imagine that'd be, or I think that that'd be one of the reasons, just trying to make people feel more comfortable with a familiar looking human-like or animal-like.
But I think that's true, but I suppose you have to push at that and say, well, in that, why are we trying to make people feel more comfortable around them? Maybe there are things to be uncomfortable around. Yeah,
absolutely. Anyone else from the panel like to comment on this issue?
I might add to that, Deborah. It's Emma here. It's certainly the case in palliative care where it's nice to have a human seeming person to talk to without the messiness of the affects that come from actual humans, particularly ones that are known to you. So that lack of fear of judgment, or the notion that the care bot is not capable or is unlikely to judge you or become upset by what you're saying, that sanitized aspect of communication is desirable and frightening all at once in that. I'm not sure in terms of the sort of broader experiences of care what we become as a society if we find these ways to avoid difficult conversations and we find more convenient modes of practice that avoid meaningful but troubling issues.
Interesting.
Kind of making it more efficient is, really a question of capital as well, that kind of haunts, I think, all of the panel presentations in terms of that question of social futures. It's really around kind of capitalist futures and even the categorization, the lumping, the kind of deferral of making more efficient through algorithmic means is, kind of all of these different processes are just driven by a logic of capital that is almost completely dehumanized. It's actually operating in its own algorithmic logic now.
Yeah, and that really came out with George's talk. I mean, I'm just thinking, getting back to my talk, that when I talked about the representations of Indigenous art in the Connection exhibition, that was absolutely against that. I mean, it wasn't about capital. It was very much about, it was called Connection. It was very much about relational connections and using digital media, digital formats, digitized artworks and music and so on, which is a way to push back against those urges towards making money or efficiency. It was absolutely not about what that exhibition was trying to do. Was absolutely not about that. And I think if we turn it around and think about maybe not robots, but about digitizing art and digitizing aspects of the natural environment in ways that you talked about too, David and Jess, in your presentation, has a lot to offer that sidesteps the whole question of efficiency and neoliberal kind of care of the self. And I know we're running a little bit over time. Helen Dickinson, hi Helen, does have I think we just take one last question. I mean, we did start a few minutes late as well. But I think we can only really have time for one last question. But I really enjoyed that discussion we just had in relation to Pia's question. But Helen says, I wonder what Georgia takes from the fact that neither of the reforms she spoke about have been implemented. Does this signal that the government has taken the concerns about care automation seriously? Or is there something else going on here? Georgia?
That's a really interesting question, and I think in both cases there's really different reasons why neither of them actually eventuated. Obviously, with the first case in Nadia, it was a sort of, in many ways, a political set of conditions that meant that Nadia just wasn't really invested in after there was a restructure of the NDIA, and essentially the executive level was sort of corporatized, and a project like Nadia wasn't really seen as something worth continuing or investing with, and there was obviously some understandable disappointment around that from the people who were engaged in the project. Particularly the Disability Innovation Reference Group, who invested their time and expertise in it. With the automated assessments, I guess it was in some ways it was the same political factors that led to the dumping of that reform. Essentially, it sort of wasn't politically palatable. They couldn't get the reforms through the Senate, and they faced such strong opposition that I think, this was obviously also after the Robodebt scandal, so there was a lot of, it was seen as a very politically sensitive area that they were working in. So yeah, I think very sort of different reasons why neither of them succeeded in a way.
Thanks, Georgia. There's so much more we could talk about, and I really enjoyed hearing everyone's talks today. Thanks very much to the presenters. Can everyone else please join me in thanking everyone for their presentations?